Hello there, and welcome to another Expert Knowledge Series video. In this video, you're going to learn all about electronic warfare. So let's get right into it, shall we? So let's start with the basics. What is electronic warfare? Electronic warfare is an activity which uses the electromagnetic spectrum or some form of directed energy to attack a target or impede a target from performing specific tasks. Now, electronic warfare is made possible due to the fact that all ships which have been powered up will emit a signature out into space. So if you're out there flying around in the Star Citizen universe, your ship will be detectable to some extent or another. Now, there are some things that you should know about the signatures that your ship will emit. First of all, as I just mentioned, all ships emit some type of signature or, in some cases, multiple signatures. For example, it can emit a heat signature or electromagnetic signatures. Now, the extent to which your ship will emit these signatures can be altered by adjusting your ship's components, like the propulsion systems, external and internal hardpoints, and so on. Also, signatures will change depending upon which activities you're engaged in at that moment. So if you're mining an asteroid field, your signature is going to be different than if you're just on a scouting patrol mission, for example. Now, no matter how skilled you are at fine-tuning the signature being emitted by your ship, you will never be able to establish a dark signature while your ship is powered up. The only way you can be completely dark is if your entire ship is powered down 100%, which has one major drawback in that you are now pretty much totally defenseless. Also, you should be aware that components that are fine-tuned to emit a lower signature than they normally would may not perform at their optimal levels. So, for example, if you tweak your shields to emit a lower signature, they may not protect your ship from enemy fire as well as if you just left them in their standard configuration. All right, now there are 4 types of signatures. The first type is the infrared signature. This is basically the heat that your ship is emitting out into space. Now, there are numerous heat sources on your ship. There are the weapons, the thrusters, any intakes on your ship, your shields, your engines, any components that are internal to your ship that generate heat, and so on. And the infrared signature that these components may emit may look something like this. So you can see all those areas that I just mentioned are in the red and orange zone, which means they're emitting a lot of heat. Whereas as you get into the green and the darker blue, those are the cooler areas of your ship. And here is a much clearer image of the heat zones on this particular ship. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it is possible to tweak the components on your ship so that they emit less heat. So that, for example, your infrared signature may look something like this after you've tweaked your systems. Now, if you're really, really skilled and you have the right equipment, you can tweak your components even further so that they emit an even smaller infrared signature. So it might look something like this. However, as I mentioned, you cannot tweak your components on your ship such that your ship is completely dark when it's powered on. So it's not going to look like this, which basically means this ship is invisible to infrared scans. So let's go over a few more points on infrared signatures. As was mentioned before, the powered components on your ship generate heat. Now, most of the heat generated on your ship is ejected out into space by your ship's heat exchangers. This ejected heat, along with heat from your thrusters and your engines, that is what is being detected by another ship's infrared scanners. Which means, unfortunately for you, that your enemies can use, for example, heat-seeking missiles and other infrared tracking devices to hunt you down. The second kind of signature is the electromagnetic signature aboard your ship. This is basically anything on your ship that is powered by electricity will emit some kind of EM signature. So these would be areas on your ship, for example, like the cockpit on your ship, which has lots of computer systems, displays, controls, that sort of thing, lots of wiring. That is a pretty big hotspot for an EM signature. Also, the area in back of the cockpit area, in the cabin, your shields, any areas on the wings that use electricity, those will all emit an EM signature. And that signature may look something along the lines of this. And here is a much clearer image showing all the hotspots aboard this ship. Now, a few points to consider about electromagnetic signatures. As mentioned before, any component that is consuming electrical power will generate some kind of an EM signature. The main sources are your ship's energy weapons, shield generators, and power plants. Intelligent power management can be used to tone down a ship's EM signature. And this would involve adjusting the power distribution grid aboard your ship as far as how much electrical power is fed to each component. And as with the infrared signature of your ship, the EM signature can be tracked by a missile's tracking systems and advanced EM detectors aboard enemy ships. The third kind of signature is the ship's cross-section. And what this shows in general is a profile of the ship on your scanners, which will most likely show very little detail regarding the surface of the ship and will just give you the overall shape. And of course, I'm not sure if the image is going to look exactly like this. This is just sort of a diagram. But you have to keep in mind that the profile that you see will change depending on the orientation of the ship relative to your ship. And a few details on this cross-section are that the cross-section of your ship is determined by another ship's radar systems. And of course, the bigger your ship, the easier it will be to be detected. Now, to a certain extent, you can modify your ship's hull to minimize the visibility of the general profile of your ship. And this is done by applying specialized hull plating to your ship that can absorb or scatter radar signals. Now, the thing to keep in mind with this armor modification is that these specialized types of armor that affect the enemy's radar on your ship, they may not be as durable as the standard armor that came with your ship. So keep that in mind. The fourth and final type of signature is the registration tag ID of your ship. So for every ship that you buy, you have to register that ship with the UEE. Think of it as getting a driver's license for your ship. And a ship's reg tag will have information such as the type of ship it is, the registration number, who owns the ship, and so on. So as you're flying around in space, your ship is continuously emitting this registration tag ID out into the void of space. And in this way, any ship that comes within your vicinity and scans you can pick up this registration tag ID to identify who you are. And a few points about the registration tags. As was stated before, your ship is continuously broadcasting its registration tag ID data to other ships in the vicinity. However, it is possible to modify your ship's transponder in order to broadcast a fake ID. Hold on now, before you get too excited. Transmitting a fake ID is extremely illegal and very risky. But then again, if you're a pirate, for example, you are already engaged in risky activities, and you would want to have a fake ID for your ship. So you're not really losing much. Now let's talk a little bit about your ship's radar and scanning systems. When your ship detects another ship out there in space, the types of information that you get back include the range to the target, the angle of travel of that target relative to your ship, the velocity of the target, And depending on the components you have on your ship and the manner in which you use them, you may also be able to detect things like the weapons aboard that ship, what kind of shields it has, what kind of armor it has, and so on. Now, there are two directions in which your ship can perform scans. The default method is omni-directional. So you're scanning in front of you and back of you, off to the sides, above and below. You're scanning everywhere. The other direction of scanning is called a narrow focus scan, which basically means you're scanning in one smaller region of space only. You're not scanning everywhere. Okay, a few points to mention regarding the differences between these two types of scanning. A more narrow focus will increase the strength of your scans, but of course it reduces the scannable area. Your local environment can definitely affect your ability to scan other objects in space. So, for example, if you're near a star, any kind of severe solar winds are just going to totally screw up your scanners. Or if you're in a nebula, any kind of ion storms in there, or any other kinds of electrical activity inside the nebula are going to just wreak havoc on your scanners as well. Now, scanning for one signature is much faster than scanning all signatures at one time. So, for example, if you know that your target out there has a very hot signature, then you're probably only going to want to do an infrared scan. Now, do keep in mind that every time you're out there scanning for targets, your radar and other scanning components on your ship will be emitting a higher signature than if they were totally shut down. So while you're scanning for other targets, your ship is now much more visible to other people trying to target you. Now, if you're on a multi-crew ship, to make the task of scanning for targets easier, all these functions that I'm talking about can be assigned to one radar officer whose only task is to scan for other targets. A large variety of radar and scanning components will be made available eventually, and each of these will have various strengths and weaknesses, and so on. Now let's talk about the two general types of scanning methods. The first one is called passive scanning, and in this type of scanning, you're basically scanning everywhere, and you're scanning out into space, and you're waiting for some unwary ship to come within your vicinity and be picked up by your sensors. And a few points about this method of scanning are, with this method of scanning, you have no particular target in mind that you're trying to get information about. What you're doing basically is you're scanning in all directions, hoping that something is going to be detected by your scanners. Now, the advantage to using this method is that it uses a relatively low level of power, which means that your signature while using this method is going to be fairly low. And this is, of course, a good thing. However, on the negative side, any information you get back from your scanners may be rather limited. For example, you may only know what area of space a ship is located in and perhaps what direction it is heading in, but perhaps not very much more than that. The other kind of scanning is called active scanning. Now, in this method, you're essentially playing the role of the hunter. You are deliberately seeking out the signatures of other ships. Now, this scan can be narrow-focused or it can be omnidirectional. However, you should keep in mind that with a narrow-based scan, you have the potential to have much more information coming back to your ship versus a omnidirectional scan. But on the negative side, a narrow-based scan uses much more energy, produces a much higher signature, which means any potential ships that you're trying to locate will have a much better chance of seeing you before you see them. Now let's talk about the scanning contact states. And what this means is when you pick up something on your radar or other scanners, how strong or weak is that contact going to be? So, for example, the first contact state is that the object is totally out of range, or you simply cannot detect a signature at all from that object. The second contact state is an uncertain contact. Now, what this means basically is you know that there's something out there, you're picking up something on your radar, but you're not quite sure what it is. It might be a false contact or any kind of signature that it's emitting, maybe on the edge boundaries of what your scanners are capable of picking up. The third scanning contact state is where you know you've spotted a ship because it is within your scanning range. However, you're getting very limited telemetry back from that ship. So, for example, you may only know where that ship is located in space relative to your ship. The fourth contact state is a completely scanned target. So this object is within your scanning range. You're able to pick up the ship's registration tag, the location of the ship, the angle of trajectory relative to your ship, the velocity of the ship, and depending on what components you're using and how they are used, the ship's weapons, shields, armor, etc. will also be known to you. All right, now let's get into some really fun stuff. Let's talk about offensive electronic warfare tactics. The first method you can use on your unwary target is a electromagnetic pulse. Oh, and as a little aside, I've made this little readout thing in the lower left-hand corner that shows how all these different methods affect a ship's weapons, shields, cooling systems, avionics, communication systems, radar, and power plant. So this is a really cool way to visualize how these different methods affect your target. Okay, so electromagnetic pulse. So what a electromagnetic pulse does, in general terms, is it causes an instant disruption of all the systems on your target's ship. So here's how it works. You fire your electromagnetic pulse weapon at a ship, and that causes all the systems on board that ship to become overloaded as far as power is concerned. So as you can see in that display diagram below, everything is redlined, everything is just going completely haywire on board that ship, and things are looking pretty bad. Now, I've taken a little artistic liberty here. I'm not at all sure, of course, if there are going to be like lightning bolts, surging throughout the ship like I've shown here, but to sort of get the point across, as it were. So with everything on board that ship completely overpowered, this causes an automatic shutdown of all the ship's computer systems, essentially powering down the entire ship. Now, of course, eventually the ship's components will come back online, but the more powerful the pulse that you fire, and I would imagine the more often you fire that pulse, the longer it's going to take for that ship's systems to come back online. Another offensive tactic is called a data spike missile. Now, what these do is they allow you to establish a direct link into the enemy ship's computer systems with the goal of totally shutting down things like the engines on the ship, the weapons, the shields, the cooling systems, etc. Now, this is a really good method if you're playing the role of a pirate, because you don't want to blast that ship to hell and turn it into a million fragments of space debris. You want that ship intact and clean. You don't want to do any actual, structural damage to the ship. So a data spike missile is a really cool way to go. Now, I'm not sure of the particulars of how this is going to work, but I'm assuming there's going to be some kind of a missile that has a payload on the tip of it that attaches itself to the hull of the target ship, like this, and then the rest of the missile floats off into space, at which point that payload will pop out an antenna and establish a direct link with your ship so that your crew members on board can use a very wide range of hacking hardware and software to break into the other guy's computer systems, and it is shutting down the weapons, the shields, and the cooling systems aboard that ship. The third offensive tactic is called a distortion surge. And what this does is it totally messes up the power plant on board the other guy's ship. So you fire your weapon, and as you can see, the output of the power plant is nearly all the way shut down. And what that causes is all the other systems aboard the ship, that the power plant feeds to get shut down as well. Now, one key thing to keep in mind when you're using this particular kind of weapon is that it is not entirely effective just to fire the weapon once. You have to fire it several times, and you have to fire it quickly. And in this way, you can cause a total power shutdown to all the components aboard your target's ship. The final offensive tactic is to use something called a signal intercept. Now, this is the most passive form of offensive maneuver in that this does no harm to the actual ship in any way. So let's say you're attacking some other ship. That ship sends out a distress call to have someone come and help them because they're getting pulverized by your weapons. You could fire a signal intercept weapon at them, and this will cause a distortion or scrambling of that person's distress call, which will then pretty much render it useless. And as you can see on the readout below, it affects communication systems and radar aboard the other person's ship. Now, depending on the type of weapon that you're using here and how it's used, you can either track where that signal is going to, you could intercept it entirely, you can reroute it to go somewhere else, or like in this case, you can totally scramble that signal that's being sent. Now, lest you think that there is absolutely nothing you can do to prevent other guys from beating the crap out of you with electronic warfare, fear not, my friends, for there are various defensive measures that you can take to thwart any sort of e-warfare the other guys want to send your way. For example, you can use something called electromagnetic flares. So let's say you're in a Drake Herald, which is an information runner, and you have just launched a data module that's going to go down to a planet. Well, that module probably contains some pretty sensitive information that you don't want to have getting into the wrong hands. So what you can do is, if you know you're being tracked by another ship when you're launching that module, you can release something called electromagnetic flares around that object. And what these will do is, these will mask the signature of that module as it travels down to the planet. So if the other ship tries to scan it, that scan will be absorbed or deflected, and you'll never even know that you sent it out there. Now, something to keep in mind here is that the electromagnetic flares that you use replace the standard IR flares that came with your ship when you bought it. However, if your ship has more than one flare launcher, like if it's a larger ship, then you can mix and match different types of flares that you can launch from that ship. Okay, another thing you can do to keep the bad guys off your tail is to use something called heat chaff. So let's say you're being scanned by the bad guys, you release your chaff, and what that chaff does is it will generate a temporary heat field outside of your ship like this. And that will, at least in theory, block any kind of infrared scanners on the other guy's ship from detecting you, because your image is blocked by a much hotter signature coming off of those flares. Now, what's nice about these flares is they cover a very large area near your ship. So these are very useful from defending yourself against infrared tracking missiles, for example. Now, because this is more of a specialized type of chaff, heat chaff replaces the standard chaff that comes with your ship when you bought it. And again, if you have more than one type of chaff launcher, you can, of course, mix and match what types of chaff that you use. You're not just confined to one. The third type of defensive tactic is to use something called data chaff. Now, this is used to guard against e-warfare attacks to your communication systems and radar systems. So again, you're being scanned by an enemy ship. You release your data chaff behind you, and that, in theory, blocks any kind of e-warfare weaponry your enemy is shooting at you. Now, one of the main things this does is it makes it much more difficult for the enemy ship to get a lock on your ship. And of course, this being a specialized kind of chaff, it replaces the standard chaff that came with your ship when you bought it. And again, if you have multiple chaff launchers, you can, of course, use different types of chaff. The fourth and final defensive tactic you can use is something called a decoy missile. Now, this is my all-time favorite. This sounds amazing. So what this decoy missile does, basically, is it will transmit a signature, get this, which will mimic the signature ID of your ship or of some other kind of ship. So once again, let's say you're being scanned by some other ship, and he's about to launch an e-warfare barrage on your ass. You can launch this decoy missile, and it will start to transmit information to fool the other ship into thinking that there's another ship in the area that might be causing trouble for them. In this case, this missile is pretending that it is a Gladius, which can probably kick that Vanguard's ass with not much trouble. So what's the Vanguard going to do? It's going to forget about its initial target, you, and it's going to start scanning this ghost ship out there to find out what the heck it's doing. Now, some things to consider about this decoy missile are that the cross-section of this fake ship cannot be simulated by a decoy missile. So using this method is not entirely foolproof. But the really cool thing is that you can configure this decoy missile to mimic a wide variety of other types of ships. Now that got me to thinking that in theory, if you had 3 or 4 of these decoy missiles, you could launch all of them at once and program them all to be ships much more powerful than that ship that is trying to attack you with its e-warfare. So this could be, at least in theory, a very effective way of getting somebody who's trying to attack you to completely ignore you and start worrying about all these other ships that are out there who might be trying to attack them. And another thought that I had on this decoy missile is, how large of a ship can these things simulate? So if I'm flying around in a Aurora, which is a fairly small, weaker ship, and I'm being tracked by a Vanguard, which is about to send a whole mess of e-warfare my way, can I release one missile, one decoy missile, and have it appear to be an Idris, or even better, a Bengal carrier? That's an interesting question which CIG, I don't think, has answered that question yet. But I may have missed something that they said earlier. Now, there are a few other ways, miscellaneous ways, to protect yourself from being scanned by an enemy ship. And the most obvious way is to modify or add specialized armor to your ship. I think I mentioned that earlier. Another way would be to get better quality shields. In particular, shields that are specifically designed to block scans from other ships. Or something else you can do is you can shield individual components or areas on your ship. So if you have some contraband cargo in your cargo hold, you can surround that cargo bay area with a specialized kind of shield that blocks any scans from getting into there while leaving the rest of your ship open to being scanned. Or something else you can do is you can alter the interior of your ship. For example, doing stuff like hiding sensitive components inside your cargo hold and having a whole mess of other crates and boxes all around it so it becomes much more difficult to detect. Now, finally, we have to talk about the legal issues regarding your ship's signature. You should be aware that it is the law of the United Empire of Earth that all ships maintain a minimum signature of each type that their ship can transmit while flying in UEE space. And what the UEE claims is that this is for public safety reasons. Now, I have a bit of a doubt about that. I mean, I'm sure that's part of it, but I think that the UEE is more concerned with knowing who's doing what and where they're doing it and why. Now, if you are caught masking the signature of your ship in any way, you will, of course, be under suspicion from any kind of local law enforcement. Well, there you go. A rather long video, jam-packed with tons of information about electronic warfare. If you have anything you want to say about this video, please do leave me a comment. And if you really want to show support for my channel, please click on that little red subscribe button down below. Until next time, this is Citizen Academy, wishing all of you fame and fortune. in the verse.